Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dogim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah, kings like Solomon, great stories, and fantastic music.
I wouldn't get too carried away there. Fantastic music.
Rick, your Haftarah chanting is always fantastic, and some weeks the trope just lend themselves to great musicality.
Well, I thank you for that compliment. Your storytelling and commentary on the Haftarot aren't anything to sneeze at either. Always interesting.
And I thank you. And we'll get to the storytelling, commentary, and chanting in just a minute. First, I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very good wine and talking Haftarah with my good chaver, the king of cantillation, Rick Muller. How are you, Rick?
Well, I'll tell you the truth, I'm a little confused.
What's the confusion, buddy?
I was trying to figure out which Haftarah we should read for this week, and I think I might have given Norm the wrong info.
Not to worry, Rick. I just looked at the Luach and sent him the information. The Luach is the guide that all Gabbais use to tell them exactly what prayers and Torah portions, Haftarah, to read every Shabbat and holiday, just like you're showing there. But I understand your confusion. The Jewish calendar can be pretty confusing, and this week's Parsha might be one of the most confusing of them all.
That's what I thought when I looked at the Chumash, and I saw 3 separate options and even some explanations for more variations.
And Rick, that isn't even the end of it. There are so many options that it's no wonder you got confused. First, we have to know whether we are reading the Shabbat P'kudei on its own or with Vayakel.
Which is one long Torah laning, let me tell you.
Yeah, those times when they're combined will make you appreciate a triennial reading, won't it? But after that, we have different options for Ashkenazim and Sephardim.
And we do with that all the time.
True, but then there are 3 other special readings that often coincide with P'kudei. Shabbat Shkalim,
which we read last week on Parshat Vayakel.
Right, and also the Haftarah for Shabbat HaChodesh, and also the Haftarah for Shabbat Para. In fact, I checked the reading for the 19-year Jewish calendar cycle and found that the Haftarah that we're discussing today from the first book of Kings, the Haftarah specifically for P'kudei, is read only 5 times out of 19 years. The most common reading is the Haftarah for Shabbat HaChodesh, which is read 9 times, followed by Para 4 times, and then Shkalim 2 times.
Is there going to be a test on this? Do I have to remember this?
No, we'll just continue to rely on the Luach. Anyway, it's clear why the sages chose this reading from 1 Kings. The Torah reading for P'kudei describes the completion of the Mishkan, or tabernacle, by Moses, and the anthropomorphic entry of the divinity into the shrine in the form of a cloud. The Haftarah parallels this with Solomon's completion of the temple and God's similar smoky entrance.
And when will you complete your work so I can make my entrance and chant the Haftarah?
Can we get a cloud effect when you start your chanting?
Wasn't exactly comparing myself to the Holy One, blessed be He.
I know, Rick. Let me just give a very brief overview, and then we'll get to the trope and the chanting. We start with the last verse of chapter 7 to set the stage. Chapter 7, verse 51 marks the completion of the temple, and Solomon is now ready to consecrate it, which he will do by bringing all of the furnishings from the tabernacle, especially the Ark of the Covenant. Then the first verses of chapter 8 describe the procession in all of its glory, from the city of David to the brand new temple. The scene really must have been something. The priests and Levites carrying the ark and all the splendid accoutrements from the Mishkan up to the temple, with the populace sacrificing bulls and oxen along the way.
Must have made for a slippery going as they marched uphill to the Temple Mount.
And for a smoky march too. Then the text describes the entrance of the ark and all of the adornments into the temple. The first part of our reading culminates with the cloud of Adonai filling the temple, described as Ha'anan maleh et beit Adonai. In fact, God's glory, or kavod Adonai, so filled the house that the priests could not do their job. Makes one wonder if this wasn't one of the illusions that we inferred from Elijah's story last week, and it got a bit out of hand.
I don't know about that, but it's interesting that in the Torah reading, Moses couldn't enter the Ohel Moed because the cloud and the Kavod Adonai filled the tabernacle. The descriptions are almost identical.
And certainly one of the reasons that the sages linked the Haftarah and the Parsha. But then in the second part of the Haftarah, we have Solomon's consecration speech, at least the beginning of it, his blessing of the people, and his explanation of how it came to be that he was the one to build the temple. Our Haftarah concludes with his making the connection between the temple, the ark that he brought into it, the covenant between God and the ancestors, and Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Sounds like a wrap.
For us, yes, but not for Solomon. This is just the beginning of a much longer continuation of his speech that goes on for the better part of 50 verses. We actually read the end of it on Shmini Atzeret, which is not surprising, since that's the holiday that actually commemorates the dedication of the temple.
How about if we dedicate some of this episode to trope and chanting?
Absolutely, Rick. To make it simple, let's divide the chanting into two parts. First, chapter 751 through chapter 8, verse 11. We have the description of the procession and the ark's entry into the temple. And then we'll follow that up with verses 12 through 21, where we have the beginning of Solomon's dedication speech.
Okay, and all right, so I like that. Before I get into the specifics of the first part, I want to note that we have two pausers in the Haftarah, the rarest of the tropes, one near the beginning, one near the end. So those kind of bracket the entire reading, and there's tons of tropotechnics between those two.
And even before that, I just want to mention that the first verse of the Haftarah is already pretty special.
It is indeed, with the special emphasis on the verbs asa, vayave, natan. Solomon did the work of finishing the temple. He brought the sacred donations of his father David and deposited them in the treasury. But if you don't mind, I want to get to the first verse of chapter 8 with the pazer.
Okay.
Okay, so the pazer is on Yisrael with a lead-in, the four munachs in front of it. The focus is on the elders, identifying them, giving them their due and honor. There's also a special trope on Hamatot Nesiei Ha'avot Livnei Yisrael, showing the importance of the ancestral chieftains. Solomon could have told his royal scribes to record that he did this all himself, taken all the credit, but he was wise to involve the participation of the leaders and the people to give the ceremony legitimacy.
Yes, sir. Wise Solomon.
And then staying there in verse 1, we have Laha'alot et Aaron Brit Adonai. The Gershaim, the Dargat Severe, emphasizes the importance of the act that they were doing, bringing up the actual ark. And there's those three special trope on the first word of the next verses, 2 and 3 and 4. Vayikahalu, gathered there, the Kadma V'Azla, and then Vayavo, the Zakef Gadol, in verse 3, they came, and then Vaya'alu, they raised up, which is the same word and the same trope that we saw in verse 1.
A lot of action in this Haftarah. Rick, if you don't mind, I have two comments. First, going back to the first verse in chapter 8, we have the verb yakel, yakhel. And you already mentioned vayikalu, that begins the second verse. Sounds like vayakel, doesn't it? And remember that we read this Haftarah when vayakel and P'kudei are combined. So there's another connection between the Torah reading and the Haftarah, although not this week. Next, I want to go back to verse 2, where every man of Israel is assembled in the 7th month which here is called B'yerach ha'etanim, which was the name of Tishrei back in the day. So we can presume that this corresponded to the festival of Sukkot, which is in that month.
Good point. So I just have a couple more trip to point out in this first part. Verse 6, Vayaviu HaKohanim, giving the priests some honor there. Et Aaron Brit Adonai El Mekomo, bringing the Ark of the Covenant again. And then in verse 7, Vayasoku Hakruvim, the verb there, the angels, the Kruvim, are extending their wings. To me, that echoes the word Sukkah, Sukkot, and it brings a prominence to that right there.
Sure. So it's connecting just to the holiday of Sukkot.
Yes.
I'll just mention, I like in the Hashkivenu prayer the phrase Ufros Aleinu Sukkat Shlomecha. Another example of that word Sukkah.
Yes, yes. And then verse 8, the Zarka and the Segol on Vayarich Habadim talks about the poles projecting out, bringing emphasis to that. I'm not sure why that's important. So the people could see something sticking out. I don't know.
Could
be.
But
there's something there because of the trope, I believe.
Very good. Great. Rick, time to chant. The text is found on the top of page 580 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, and also on your screens. Thanks to Norm Gar with the beautiful graphics. But first, the bracha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Vatishlam kol hamlacha asher asa hamelech Shlomo beit Adonai vayavei Shlomo et kodshei David aviv et hakesef vet hazahav vet hakelim Natan be'otzrot beit Adonai Az yakhel Shlomo et ziknei Yisrael et korashei hamatot Nesi'ei ha'avot livnei Yisrael El HaMelech Shlomo Yerushalayim Leha'alot et Aaron Brit Adonai Me'ir David Hi Tzion Vayikahalu El HaMelech Shlomo Kol Ish Yisrael B'yerach ha'etanim B'chag Hu HaChodesh HaShvi Vayavo'u Kol Ziknei Yisrael Vayisu HaKohanim Et Ha'aron Vaya'alu Et Aaron Adonai B'Ohel Moed B'Kol Klei HaKodesh Asher Ba'ohel Vaya'alu Otam HaKohanim V'Alevim V'Amelech Shlomo V'Chol Adad Yisrael Anoadim Alav Ito Lifnei Haaron Mezabchim Tzon Uvakar Asher Lo Yisafru V'Lo Yimanu Merov Vayaviu HaKohanim Et Aaron Brit Adonai El Mekomo El Dvir Habayit El Kodesh HaKodashim, El Tachat Kanfei HaKruvim, Ki HaKruvim Porsim Knafayim, El Mekom Ha'aron, Vayasoku HaKruvim, Al Ha'aron Ve'al Badav Milmala, Vayarichu Habadim, Vayera'u is how I think that should be. Rashi Habadim Min HaKodesh Al Pnei Hadvir, Velo Yera'u Hachutza, Vayiyu Sham Ad Hayom Hazeh. Ein Ba'aron Rak Shnei Luchot Avanim, Asher Hiniach Sham Moshe B'chorev, Asher Karat Adonai Im Bnei Yisrael B'tzeitam Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Vayehi b'tzeit hakohanim min hakodesh, ve'anan maleh et beit Adonai, v'lo yachlu hakohanim lamod lesharet mipnei ha'anan, ki maleh chvod Adonai et beit Adonai.
Rick, I'll drink to that.
Okay.
I bet they had their share of wine too on the procession.
Yes.
Anyways, what's special about the second part of our Haftarah?
Okay, as you pointed out, the beginning of Solomon's dedication is the speech there. And the first thing that I see is the language is very simple and straightforward, suggesting Solomon was making an effort to speak directly to the common people.
Perhaps, but I'm not quite sure. Those first words of Solomon are terse poetry, very compact, but very powerful. First, Solomon says that he says, Adonai Amar Lishkon Ba'arafel. Adonai meant to abide in thick fog. And then, Bano Vaniti Beit Zavul Lach. Indeed, I have built you a lofty house. And then, Machon L'shivtecha Olamim, a firm place for your dwelling forever. Solomon is speaking both to the people and to God. There's an interesting use of the word Amar in the first part, meant chosen, which means chosen or meant rather than said. Then I like the repetition of Bano Vaniti, the doubling giving emphasis to Solomon's having built this temple for God.
Interesting, but notice the simplicity of the trope here. And this continues in verse 15. Baruch Adonai Elohei Yisrael. I like the formula, very simple for the common people to connect with.
Rick, there's a real interesting turn of phrase in verse 15 and some contrasting translations. I'm comparing JPS and Alter. The phrase is, Asher diber befiv et David aviv uviado mileh. The JPS translates this as, who has fulfilled with deeds the promise he made to my father David. But Alter is truer to the literal meaning with his translation, who spoke with his own mouth to David my father, and with his own hand has fulfilled it.
Clearly, Solomon is reminding the people that his father had a personal relationship with God, as in, hey, my dad and God were BFFs. Things get a bit more involved in verse 16. The Kadma V'Azla Asher Hotzeti. The drama there reminding the people where we started, following by that second Zarka on Et Ami et Yisrael, Mi Mitzrayim, giving importance to that, my people Israel from Egypt, which is our people's origin story.
course.
And then the second pazer in verse 20, the pazer is on the word va'akum, followed by tachat David avi, vayshev al kisei Yisrael, kasher diber Adonai, which the JPS translates as, I've succeeded my father David, and I've ascended the throne of Israel as the Lord promised. But I wonder if the JPS translation is totally correct here.
Very interesting question, Rick. In fact, Alter's translation is, I arose in place of David, my father. Alter thinks that Solomon is reminding the people that David designated him, Solomon, to succeed him.
And maybe Solomon's going a little further than that. The beginning of the verse is Vayakem Adonai, and then Solomon says Va'akum with a pazer. Just as God fulfilled his word, so too Solomon's rising to the power of the throne is a fulfillment of God's word. Vayakem, Va'akum, he fulfilled, I arose.
Solomon was nothing if not self-assured, Rick. Take us home by chanting verses 12 through 21.
Az Amar Shlomo, Adonai Amar, Lishkon Barafel, Bano Vaniti, Beit Zevul Lach, Machon Shivtecha Olamim, Vayasev HaMelech et Panav, Vayevarech et kol kahal Yisrael, v'chol kahal Yisrael omed, vayomer, Baruch Adonai Elohei Yisrael, asher diber befiv et David avi, uvyado mile lemor. Min hayom asher hotzeiti et ami et Yisrael mimitzrayim lo bacharti ve'ir mikol shivtei Yisrael livnot bayit liyot shmi sham Vayevchar beDavid liot alami Yisrael vayehi im levav David avi livnot bayit l'shem Adonai Elohei Yisrael vayomer Adonai el David avi Ya'an asher haya im levavcha livnot bayit lishmi hetivota ki haya im levavecha rak ata lo tivne habayit ki im bincha Hayotze mechalatzecha hu yivne habayit lishmi vayakem Adonai et varo asher diber va'akum tachat David avi vayshev al kisei Yisrael, kasher diber Adonai, va'evne habayit l'shem Adonai Elohei Yisrael, va'asim sham makom la'aron, asher sham brit Adonai, asher karat im avotenu, Ve'otziotam me'eretz Mitzrayim.
Great. As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics. the text, and for his editing. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and family. Next week, we have something special. It's Shabbat Zachor, which has its own special Haftarah. We discussed that last year and will reprise that episode for you. But the following week is Purim, which is preceded by the Fast of Esther. We're going to discuss and chant the special Haftarah for the afternoon of fast days. And that episode will be available to you before next Shabbat.
As we continue to examine all the different Haftarot recited throughout the year and years. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.